Okay, we'll make a start. So firstly, welcome everybody to our first event in our series, Employee Wellbeing Post-Pandemic, Seizing the Opportunity. This event series is a collaboration between King's College London, University of East Anglia and the Ministry of Defence. My name is Dr. Mike Clinton. I'm an academic work psychologist with a long-standing interest in wellbeing and a co-organiser of this event series. In a moment, you'll hear from Martin Short of the MOD. He's also a co-organiser, and towards the end, Kevin Daniels of UEA, who's our final co-organiser. And we will be hearing from two brilliant speakers today about their work on the impact of the COVID pandemic on employee wellbeing. But firstly, I'll pass over to Martin Short, who'll just tell you a little bit about why we're running this event series to begin with.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for listening in. So I just wanted to say a few words before we started about how this particular series of events came into being. So I think if we sort of reflect back on the COVID experience over the past year or so, it's had an effect on so many lives across the world. And while some of us have breezed through the experience relatively unscathed, for an awful lot of people, it's really brought untold misery. So the emotional upheaval of bereavement, isolation from friends, family, colleagues, increased anxiety as a result of those factors, loss of livelihoods, income, support networks. And it's also exposed a lot of underlying inequalities in society and highlighted just how important investing in mental health and well-being can be as individuals, communities, and as organisations. But like all experiences in life, positive or negative, there is an opportunity for us to learn from this experience. And it's not so much what's happened, because what's happened has happened. It's really what we take away from that experience and how we learn from it. One outcome that has been of increased interest is just really how we attend to our well-being needs at both individual and organisational level. And a lot of us have had an opportunity to reflect on the things that we regard as being important to us personally in our lives, be that in our domestic lives or our work lives. And also, we've had a lot of opportunity now to explore new ways of working that few of us would have, possibly imagined, back in 2019. So the idea for this series of events, came about as a result of conversations between King's College, University of East Anglia, and my bit of the Ministry of Defence, which is Defence Intelligence. And the main aim of it really is to see if we can get some conversations going so that employers can learn and focus on building back better in wellbeing terms after COVID. So the four presentations in the series, what they seek to do is bring academics and practitioners together so we can aspire to combine that organisational lived experience with some of the most recent academic research as well. And that's why we've got that sort of twinning of academics and practitioners in each event. So with that brief introduction, I'm really delighted to hand back to Professor Mike Clinton from King's, who will be running the event for us today. Thanks, Mike. Over to you.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, we've got two brilliant speakers today, Professor Stephen Wood and Chief Inspector Steve Kerridge, and I'll introduce both of those in a moment. Firstly, a little bit about the format today. So both speakers are going to talk for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then towards the end, we'll have a Q&A session. If you look at your Zoom screen, towards the right-hand bottom edge is a Q&A box. If you have a question, please do write the question into that Q&A box, and then we'll try and address those questions towards the end. Okay, without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. So Stephen Wood is a Professor of Management at the University of Leicester, formerly who was involved heavily with the Institute of Work Psychology in Sheffield. He's a Fellow of the British Academy of Social Science and Academic Fellow of the CIPD. Stephen has made major academic contributions across his research career in areas such as high involvement management, HRM and job design, and I go on and on and on. But today he's going to be talking about his research on home working during the pandemic. So I'll now pass over to Stephen and leave you now.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thanks for inviting us to this session and for the introductions. I think it's very timely at the moment because you're probably reading in the press and in your own organisations the discussions that are going on about going back from home working to either everybody going back to work on site or at least some form of a hybrid. So initially, when the pandemic took off, people took the view that, well, this is going to be accelerate trends are already there, one of which was, of course, the digitalisation. And home working was one of those, and it was seen as a kind of win-win situation. Employees liked it, and they seemed satisfied with it. They saved on commuter time, and also they could see more of their family. Equally, employers could save on office space and save money and so on. And there was reports of reluctance for employees to want to go back even a year ago when we were thinking about people going. People did go back a bit last year. And then other companies announced, like Santander and so on, they announced they were going to do this. Nationwide was going to let anybody who wanted to work at home. And surveys by the CIPD reinforced this and so on. But there's been a bit of a backlash, not least from those with lots of property involved in this, such as the head of strategy at the Canary Wharf Group and other such people. And Apple only this week has announced that their employees in California must come back at least 3 days a week. And they've got themselves into a mess because the employees just turn around and say, we haven't consulted this. This is the first we heard of this. We like it, and well, at least we want some kind of recognition of the benefits for us. And so it's a really timely day to discuss these issues. And clearly, the future depends on the choices of employees, employers, jointly or independently. And we could argue, well, why do we need to discuss this? Just let people do what they want and see what happens. After all, in England, in the UK. There is a right to flexible working enshrined in law. So do we actually need to do anything? Well, my answer is yes and no. Certainly the future will depend on the choices that you and I and others make, both as employers and employees. But I would argue the no is that we do need very careful consideration. Home working is one of the key aspects of the pandemic which hasn't come under a lot of criticism compared with most other aspects. But as Michael said at the beginning, it's offered us an unplanned experiment in home working. So actually to systematically learn from this experience, both through academic work and through applying that work and thinking about our own particular situations, just as a medic takes the knowledge from outside, from his or her subject, they also apply. When they apply it, they look at the individual circumstances of their patients and their environment and so on. That's what evidence-based management does. It's not just literally a formulaic approach to management. So I think the crucial thing is that we combine the knowledge that we're gaining both through academic work and through our own experience and surveys in our own organisations, so with employee involvement of a much richer nature than perhaps we're used to, really. And then we will get to a state where we have packages that allow for people's differences, and also that most people will be comfortable with the package that they have, whether it's a hybrid or whatever. Clearly, we can't have bespoke management, but it does mean that line managers become very important because they in some sense have to have a dialogue. But there's also other organisational-wide initiatives we can do, old-fashioned quality circles, for want of a better word, working parties, that can be done virtually now, that we can set in train to get us. So that's my overall approach to this at this particular point in time. What I wanted to do today was to set the scene, which I've done, and then I'll tell you about my study, and then I'll look at the implications for policy making and evaluation. I've already said, will hybrid working become inevitable? Will it become the new normal, or is it indesirable? And we need evidence-based with situational knowledge founded in employee involvement. And so my study is a contribution to this evidence-based. We've done a number of things. We've done 2 surveys, which we repeated over 4 weeks in May last year and September and October, over 800 employees in 2 universities. And then we had a baseline before that, where you find out about the demography of your sample and so on. And then we had 3 surveys which were conducted in July and October and February, which were focused on some of the issues we're talking about today, but particularly on the issue of uncertainty. And we also followed up with focus groups, and I've done some individual interviews as well with participants. So we've got a rich database, which has enabled us to make some points that I want to summarize very briefly. Sorry, the chair, I don't, my clock has gone off my screen on my machine. So if I'm overrunning, just let me know, but I'll try and I didn't bring my watch in. I'll try and stick to another 8 minutes, if that's okay by you.
Yeah, I'll give you a 3-minute warning, Stephen.
Oh, right. Thank you. The first thing, really important, given the fact that employers and the media are saying, well, people are satisfied with home working. The first important point is that satisfaction levels are not the same as well-being. Satisfaction is an indicator of these things, but in our study, by about October, 80% of people were satisfied with working at home. And of course, you don't know to what extent that has factored in the fact that it's an abnormal situation and they're tolerant of it. But generally, from the focus groups, there is a group of people who are almost converts, almost like Tony Blair being converted to science when he was a prime minister. These people are really converted. I want to stay at home. I never thought I would enjoy it. And that's distinct from well-being, because we see levels of 50% of people at certain points in the year had very high levels of anxiety or above average anxiety levels, and also their enthusiasm was waning and so on. So they are distinct, really. And the second thing is that the factors that affect these two things, satisfaction and well-being, are obviously then distinct. And the first point is to make is that commute time does affect satisfaction, but it doesn't affect well-being. That's the most obvious example. There are other things that, the most important thing is that the things that determine the well-being of home workers in our sample are the downsides of home working. They're not the positive things so much. And it's the loneliness and isolation that Michael talked about that's important, and the ability to detach from work. And we know about this. We know that blurring of the boundary between work and non-work psychologically affects recovery from work the next day or in the future. So it's quite important for one's health, and it affects sleep and so on and so on. The third thing, which may be a bit strange and also is very important, is that we had a set of questions about the enforced nature of home working, the effects of it. Were you constrained by homeschooling? Were you constrained by IT? Were you constrained by not having information? And so on. And we had a set of questions about them, and these were not significant for well-being particularly, certainly not consistently over time. And that's good news in a way, because it means that we can, to some extent, generalize, or we can't just, if we found that dominated, that all the pandemic and enforced nature of home working dominated the well-being, then we'd say we can't really do much with this other than report that. It won't help us in the future. The fact that it doesn't kick, as it were, then it gives us some idea that we can use these results, although, as I've already made the point, that we cannot know that what's going to happen in the future will replicate exactly. But the downsides of homework are well known from studies before the pandemic. So we can be pretty confident that these are genuine, universal downsides. And the thing that came out of the focus groups was that people miss the social side, and they're not chomping to go back to work, but they miss each other. And I feel I miss my colleagues, and just seeing people, and Teams is considered to be quite good, or Zoom, but it doesn't substitute. And there's evidence that it's a very different experience working from the screen and so on. And the important thing about the social side, that people are not saying, I'm missing going to the pub on a Friday, I'm missing going coffee breaks. So they may say that, but it's because they realize there's an intrinsic element to jobs that requires collective behavior. And particularly people talk about having able to bounce ideas back and get information back quickly from people. So it's the way in which the social side is intrinsic to jobs, which is very, very important. The other thing in universities, and I think it's probably true in a lot of organisations, and obviously that's something we'd welcome from the audience today, their views about it. This has all been in the context of increasing job demands and accommodations that have been made to these. And I think the ones that in the universities particularly, but I'm sure they're in other places, people responded to the job demands, some of which were the result of the pandemic. So we had to set up online teaching. We had to, we have this screen work, which itself, according to Stanford University, increases your job demands, just being on the screen job. It's called Zoom fatigue, in fact. And the accommodations people made to these things were quite a lot. They were increased hours, they limited their holidays, they elongated the day, so they're working till 10 at night, perhaps doing the schooling at home in the daytime. We found a correlation between the increased demands and constraints on exercise. People felt that they had to stay at home rather than go exercise. And these all adversely affected well-being. And that's where this thing about the future comes in. And where maybe employers will think, well, they won't even know perhaps that they've increased job demands, but they will actually think, well, we can carry on at the same level as before, without realizing that these accommodations may have been conditional. And people might say, well, I'm not prepared to, I'm happy with the hybrid or whatever you want to put forward as your way of working, but I'm certainly not going to start being constrained from exercise or whatever. So those are some of the 4 pennyworths from my and my colleagues' research, which has been taking place at the University of Leicester and the University of Exeter. Well, what are the implications of this? I think the first implication I've already made is that it actually means that the results can be used because they're not just dominated by the enforced nature of the home working. The creeping demands needs a special consideration, it seems to me, that we have to think about, well, what was the workload in this situation? And was it a temporary thing that people thought they were happy? It was like a Dunkirk spirit thing, and is it something that employees are actually worried about, that there's going to be a subtle ratchet up of their demands, and they want to perhaps resort back to earlier demands and so on. I've already made this point that we shouldn't be making decisions on the basis of satisfaction and performance levels. It's inadequate for the reason I've made, but also these are based on self-report satisfaction and performance levels. And often they're just managers saying that my workforce has not has continued to work better or even, as well, or if not better than before. And so there's a real problem with it. And we know at the individual level, self-report performance levels are very iffy. We'll exaggerate our performance and so on. The other implication is obvious that we must prioritize well-being, as Michael said at the beginning, and so on. The downsides of isolation and constraints on psychological detachments must be addressed, and these are the ways to do this. Are very subtle and need some clear-cut thinking about. And the peer support, of course, is important, but these can lead to very simplistic solutions like let's have virtual birthday parties, or let's make sure we have a damn good party when we go back to work on site and so on. But I think the place to start is with genuine employee involvement, starting now, if you like. And obviously we make the point about what I mentioned earlier about remote working parties. Leaving aside the problems of team, if they're done well, this is a way of making people connect and getting around the belongingness. So you have virtual working parties with cross-hierarchy and cross-disciplines in your organization, really working on very specific projects and so on. I think this should become the norm in hybrids, because I think that's the way to meet people connected. And where better to start than with the home working situation and the units that you go to. And
about 3 minutes, Stephen.
Thank you very much. That's perfect. It's exactly what I need, I think. The protocols, peer group support can be very important for setting protocols for future work and so on. And also you can have a discussion about what can be done and what can't be done at work, at home and what at work. And I think that's a very useful exercise for teams to do, to say, well, this is, and you'll find actually, you'll be surprised that Well, first of all, you'd be surprised at how you actually start to discuss work in a different way when you do this. I did this with a colleague, a non-academic colleague at work, and I was surprised how he described his job, but also I think he wasn't describing his job in the way he would have done before. So I think that exercise itself is very interesting. Clearly, detachment from work can be encouraged by things like no emails after a certain time. We have that in our organisation, but people then turn around and say, well, I don't finish at 5 because, in fact, I'm only starting work at 5 because I've been homeschooling and so on. So we have to be careful that it's much better, really, to get an involvement about online onboarding, if you like it. And so you develop codes of conduct at a sort of local level. And the issue about detachment is a much more fundamental question about job design and ensuring autonomy. So we create jobs that do generate enthusiasm, because the only positive result we found was the one that's ubiquitous across any work situation, that job autonomy does have positive effects on enthusiasm and calmness and so on. And the aim is not just to increase autonomy, but it would be to actually make, if the boundaries are becoming blurred, you make them what's called integrative. You make the boundaries integrative, so they have a positive effect on enthusiasm and performance. There are clear tensions in home working. There's the tensions we've alluded to already. You increase autonomy at the expense of home work life becoming blurred. You become more focused, maybe through working at home, at the effects on your eyes and the back strain and so on. You get more peace and quiet, but no, you miss out on social interaction. So it's the Janus-headed nature of home working that we really need to consider. And I think this is why, of course, hybrid becomes popular, because it seems to give you the benefits of both worlds, and if you like, overcomes a resolution to the Janus-headed two sides of home working. But I think it remains to be seen whether it does do that. And you can imagine all kinds of ways in which it might not be such a wonderful resolution. And one of the last points I want to make is that in the focus groups, people are absolutely adamant. It was one of the only times they got negatively adamant. I was amazed how positive the people in my focus groups. Of course, they're a biased sample of people who want to be part of the focus group, but they got adamant that if there were going to be hybrids and there were going to be stations, hubs and so on, they had to work, and they didn't want what they called frigging around in the morning with their laptops, trying to find a station and getting there. Everything had to be as you would as in a normal work situation, in inverted commas. And they also didn't want to bring their laptops in and out of work, especially those who, we tend to over-exaggerate on commuting. There are many people who walk to work, and quite long distances, of course, and they can't bring their laptops and so on. And the last point I want to stress is that the methods we use as social scientists are very familiar to a lot of you, because you've done dissertations to get your professional qualifications or whatever. But they're a vehicle for employee involvement. So you can get your. The danger is that surveys have become a substitute for employee involvement. Attitude surveys, we get them all the time at work. They're not badly designed. There's nothing wrong with them. They're a bit like market research, and there's no feedback on them. There's no involvement in the design of these things. And there is a distinction between the survey feedback method that we advocate as social scientists or HR specialists, and just doing a survey. And so if you do a survey method, make sure that it's part of your employee involvement. And the point I made about it has become a substitute for employee involvement in the public sector, I think. It's not employee involvement without those things. But more importantly, you have to have other forms of employee involvement, such as the ones I mentioned and so on. So I think the lesson for me from all this is just to reinforce what you might want to say is my prejudice, is that we're terrible at employee involvement in England. And partly I think it is because managers think they're doing it when they're not doing it. And we must get on top of this as a nation. And you could say, well, your researcher is you've just imposed your values on the research. I don't think I have. I think that through a carefully orchestrated increase in employee involvement, taking home working as the catalyst for this, we can get matches between what individuals want and what employers want, which will increase work-life balance for all. Thank you.
Stephen, thank you very much. I don't know whether people can unmute and applause, but certainly you're getting some applause from me where I'm sitting. What we'll do is we will have some questions at the end. Stephen, if I could ask you to stop sharing your slides, that's perfect. And I'll just remind everyone, all the participants in the webinar, to ask their questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those at the end. Okay, now I will introduce our second speaker for the day. We're very lucky to have with us Chief Inspector Steve Kerridge of Cambridgeshire Constabulary. Steve has been a police officer for over 20 years, undertaking a wide variety of different roles, and he is currently leading the Constabulary's Agile working programme, following on from his role as COVID-19 Head of Recovery and Learning. Steve is going to discuss in much more detail about that project and how that's involved a move to Agile working during this pandemic. So I'll pass over to Steve and mute my microphone.
Super, thank you, Mike, and thanks to Stephen for that thought-provoking initial session. Very subtly, you'll see I'm wearing a policing uniform, and I'm also sat in my home address in sunny East Cambridgeshire here. So, as I say, I apologise for that lack of subtlety there. I'm just going to share the screen, so if you just bear with me a moment as I just do that. There we go. Right.
Yeah, we go. It's coming through now, Steve.
Excellent stuff. Thank you. So, very interesting to start off with all of the majority of the points that Stephen's already covered. Spookily, we will see in a kind of the practical sense in terms of the presentation I'm now going to give in relation to our practical experience within Cambridgeshire. So, I want to start a little bit by setting some context around Cambridgeshire Constabulary. I want to set a little bit of context around the challenges for policing of COVID-19, which there are some generic challenges that all workplaces, all organisations have experienced, but there's also some specifics for policing that I'll cover off as well. And then I want to move a little bit more into talking around the term we're using as Agile working, but you'll see some additional terminology that will come in as well. So my focus is very much talking about the practical element as a county police force of about 3,100 people. But you'll also see as we go through the sequencing with the academic work that's been done by University of East Anglia, and the relationships we've had with others as some of our really strong regional partnerships looking at academia and policing. So I just want to set the context first and foremost. So you'll see on the screen something that we were using at the beginning of 2020. So this is a summary slide of our strategic threat and risk assessment process, what's called STRA. So this is part of our business planning cycle. Now, COVID-19 recovery is around about 6 o'clock on that clock face that you will see there. But this was put together very much when we were in the early phases of COVID, and people were still saying, yeah, perhaps it's a bit of a flash in the pan, but because we've run this in the way that we have, we need to have a proper recovery strand. But what I just wanted to draw people's attentions to on here is very much early 2020, before COVID-19 necessarily taken off in our minds in terms of concern, and before the fateful lockdown, which we'll come on to in a second. If you look at that clock face from about 4 o'clock round to about 7 or 8, you'll see lots of issues there around wellbeing, financial gaps for us as an organisation, our estates planning, COVID-19 recovery, digital innovation. So things that really have come to the fore as we've gone through COVID, but were there previously. So it comes back to Stephen's point around COVID almost accelerating things that were happening. So from a policing perspective, I've tried to just sort this into 2 columns for people. So every workplace, everyone that I've spoken to, and friends, colleagues, people in different industries, etc., there are a number of things we've had to face in our workplaces as we've gone into COVID. So clearly, whether you're providing a service or a product or whatever, business as usual has had to adapt significantly to the way society has changed. So whatever you're providing, whatever you're putting out there, clearly you've had to adapt. Health and well-being of staff is obviously extremely important for everyone in terms of being probably our most important asset in most organisations. And the huge challenges that people have had around COVID-19 secure. where we're suddenly in an environment where we can't be within certain distances of certain people. So huge implications around that. From a policing perspective, what has also been interesting, of course, and Stephen talked about a kind of a Janus element there. There's also a Janus element within policing in terms of not only considering how it's affecting us, but obviously our duty and responsibilities to the public. So for the last 14 months, we've had to maintain order and the peace during a prolonged period of social tension and societal tension, which has made things quite challenging for us. New demand has obviously come in relation to crime patterns and trends and tensions within communities. But also, as well as serving the public, as well as looking at our own internal workings, there are other issues as well. So the police service as a Category 1 responder has a very primary role to play in civil contingencies. So in local resilience fora, in every county, in every area, we have a leadership responsibility in terms of working and coordinating partnership agencies, local authorities, working with health, etc., as well as our own business. And of course, finally, health protection regulations, enforcement that has come in that we've had to deliver as the primary agents, of course, in some respects, a decision being made on Friday and us being on a Monday morning, still kind of thinking, well, actually, what is the law telling us and what do we have to do? So some interesting things there around when we're focusing on staff, some of the implications for the pressures they have as well as health and well-being. So I want to move on to talking particularly around the workplace issues that we're here to talk about today. So just to set the scene, on the 23rd of March 2020, Cambridgeshire Constabulary was an organisation that was really well digitally enabled. We were one of the first forces to have really good mobile technology platforms, but we still had a culture of being in the office. Not always in the same office, but in an office, within an office footprint. So we pretty much did that, all of us, all of the time, irrespective of roles. On the 23rd of March, when we all tuned in, probably to terrestrial TV for the first time in a long time for some of us to see the Prime Minister tell us that we must stay at home, overnight we shifted from that position to 65% of our staff essentially being at home and a 35%, so about a third, essential presence in the workplace. And of course, in policing, there are a number of roles where you can't sit at home. Or you can, but you're not exactly going to be very effective in upholding the many challenges that you need to deliver. So I just want to set that context, because a little bit later on when we talk about the future, I'll talk a bit more about the percentage shift. So going from almost 100% workplace to 65 at home, 35% in the workplace. So we tried quite early on to think about how we could consider the impact when we moved to that position. So we were very active in the summer last year. We're working with UEA, as we'll detail in a moment, to look at what are the implications of this for our staff. I very much am a believer that there's a long view to be had about this. And Stephen talked a little bit around the fact that we have honeymoon periods, things are starting to change, and I'll talk a little bit about our experiences of that in a sec. But what we wanted to do is we were really lucky to be able to use UEA to actually use what I thought was a really innovative approach, which was actually looking at a diary-based survey over a period of time with staff to look at their experiences. And as detailed there, started with a survey, a diary study, some good qualitative interviews there as well to look at the implications. And we supplemented that throughout the year, right the way up until the winter of last year, by our own Organisational Improvement Centre, who are our research leads, doing 11 departmental focus groups to look at some more specifics around some of those things. So we do have some of our colleagues from UEA here today, and I'm not an academic. I have fairly limited research experience within the bigger picture. But a couple of things I wanted to just draw out from that excellent work, and one of the things I really liked, which came from it, is this consideration around job satisfaction, life satisfaction, and performance. So some really interesting stuff that came out around that, and there's a couple of statistically significant bits and pieces that are referred to in the slide there. But as you can see there, looking at 10 being the top end of the scale, obviously, the job satisfaction element of that, we can see a decline, but a statistically significant decline in terms of the job satisfaction amongst staff during the study. Wider life satisfaction, and this goes back to Stephen's points around all those good things that people could achieve at home, etc., was up, but not, again, significantly so in terms of statistical significance. And performance, again, down, statistically significant, but hugely problematic in terms of how we define performance and how we measure it. But based on people's views of themselves, again, some significance there around that. So on face value, that's very interesting, a way of chopping things up, and very useful for me as the person that was charged to look at what we do with it. But as listed on the slide there, we have to be hugely aware of the fact that there were some real diversity in terms of views, and potentially there's a huge amount of information there in terms of picking around how it affects different people in different ways. We have over 150 different roles that are undertaken within our organisation, so lots of opportunity to look through that. Our own internal work, I'm not going to, quite a busy slide this one, but I just want to draw out a couple of things here. And again, this chimes in with some of the discussion already. So the main advantage that was listed by our focus groups was, of course, the flexibility in terms of what was afforded to people. The greatest barrier, even as an early adopting force with good tech, was still issues around tech for our staff. And the main disadvantage was around isolation. And I'll come on to that a little bit later on, just to talk about issues of becoming detached from the organisation, mental health challenges, a lot of elements around that, which I'll come on to in a sec. So flexibility, supervision. A lot of people felt they were more efficient, but again, and Stephen touched on this, we have to be a bit careful around, particularly in the early phases of someone, people's self-assessment around what's good and what's bad, etc. And some conflicting information about that as things went on from there. And we've invested a lot of time in looking at different effects since this work on different departments. So if we just pull together both the work that UEA did and the work that we did internally, I won't go through all of these things, but this slide pretty much shows the things that came up in both studies, the things that were quite regular, quite frequent in terms of the debates and the discussions that we were having. So if we look at the benefits, again, getting a lot done, people basically feeling less tired, less stressed, a willingness to do things differently, which I think was good, which came out from our organisation, which was really, really, really good. Some differences around supportive nature across different departments, etc. And then there's some obvious harder facts and figures there around travel expenses, organisational expense, all of those bits and pieces. And generally people liked, Stephen talked about a hybrid model, this hybrid and the degree of control over and beyond being forced in a certain way. And some of the challenges there, very much confirmation of what we've already talked about. So aside from the issues around sort of equipment and some of those things, there's some really interesting stuff, again, around the effectiveness of management, around the issues of how we assess performance, how we look at appraisal. And as we'll come on to a little bit later on, again, early warnings of division within the organisation, the haves and the have-nots. I'm very fortunate what I do in the organisation, I have a degree of flexibility. If you are going to emergencies in a police car, you don't. So we have to be really careful, and we were monitoring early issues around tensions between different groups. So again, I won't go through all of this, but I'm sure this will be made available for people to look at if you so wish. And this is really helpful. This is from UEA in terms of the barriers and the enablers for performance and wellbeing during agile working and hybrid working that came from the work that Kevin and others were doing for us. So some key barriers there. Again, chiming with what we've talked about IT, communication being a really interesting point, as I'll come on to in a second, and some challenges we found around communication, lack of recognition around difference, and again, some other bits and pieces to think about in terms of moving this forward, which we have. And then enablers, really, really interesting. So we spent quite a lot of time talking to people about what has enabled you to work in this way, what support have you had that's been beneficial, and some really, really good things that I'll draw out in a second as I start to draw to a close. So really good summary of barriers and enablers. One of the enablers, and actually a summary of some of the enablers had brought through some really good work that had come from that survey, which Kevin and others within the UEA have made available, which is something that we're utilising directly in the organisation, which is this checklist, which we are using with our management as part of a kind of a rethink of how we train some of our managers to think about how they engage in the hybrid workplace. So this checklist, focusing on conditions, relationships and opportunities, is almost literally a checklist for people to just think about, and something that we're bringing into our regular appraisals just to make sure where people are during this time of continuing hybrid working as we're now doing. So really, really super and helpful. And again, a great example of a piece of research very quickly being turned around into something practical that we're using across our organisation. So we're grateful for that. So where are we now going forward? And I'll start to summarise a couple of bits and pieces and sort of let you know where we are. So we started off, as we talked about, as an organisation focused largely on being in the footprint. We switched over in March 20 to suddenly about a third of our people being in the workplace and 2/3 being at home. the time we've been through and we've assessed and analysed and done work around every role profile in the organisation to start looking at working with staff and engaging staff and enabling staff to contribute around, when we look at role profiles, which role profiles are suitable and which are not for different ways of working. And in terms of fairness, one of the things we wanted to do, and we spoke to staff about this, we said the fairest way in an organisation with such a diversity of roles undertaken, police officers and police staff, we have to look at role profiles as being the fairest way of defining how people can work. And also clearly a way to avoid us finding ourselves in hot water about issues around inequality and obligations and statutory requirements around equality. So we had a lot of conversations, and actually what we've arrived at, and there is a bigger presentation behind us that I've used that goes into detail around where those things are, which I'm more than happy to share across the organisation. But what we've now found is that we think, whereas we were forced to go a certain way in March 2020, we now think about 37, so just over a third of our staff, we think could continue to work in a way where they have a proportion of their time at home. Okay, and as you will see there, we feel that probably about 6% of our workforce could largely work completely away from the state, although we have made a policy decision that no one will be a pure home worker for reasons that you'll see in a moment. And as you can see there, about 16%, that's a slight error there, so 16% and 15% we've also shown there is the difference between so up to 16%, up to 10%, 15%, 50-50 split in terms of where we're working. So adding those up, as I say, to the kind of the 37% across the organisation. So that is a shift. That will be moving people back into the workplace to some degree, which again has got to be put through the lens of all of those things we've talked about, like COVID-19 secure, which I'll come on to in a second. And lots of interesting meetings this week where I, in terms of my responsibility in my organisation, I'm still not sure where the country's going to go in terms of COVID-19 secure and health and safety executive guidance, public health guidance. Are we all going to be working in an environment where we continue to be distanced, or we continue to be using PPE with some regularity, or are we returning to normal? What's the timescale? We don't know. So
I'll give you 3 minutes, Steve.
Thank you. So that's the vision of where we're going. So really what we want to work on, a connected agile workforce is what we're working with, and a hybrid approach, as Stephen has said. Our balance is between productivity and health and wellbeing. As an organisation, we've been very focused for a long time on the health and wellbeing of our staff. And it's really come to the fore again through this, and I'm really pleased with how that's developed within the organisation. And as you'll also see there, some more practical things around what we're looking at in terms of estate, how we're moving to more open zones and less traditional offices there. And I mentioned the redesign of our supervisory and leadership approach. There's core stuff we have to train our managers in as a police service, but there's a huge amount of more stuff we can learn from in the last 12 months or so around human relationships and a new environment in which we have to operate and manage our people successfully. And the continuation of technological enablement. So finally, busy slide this one, but I want to draw out some key things. So if I was only to present one slide today, it would be this one. And from my experience and what I'm trying to do now in Cambridgeshire Constabulary, these are the issues and my reflections. I just want to go through them. And again, chimes in a lot with what Stephen had talked about. So isolation, mental health, well-being, really high on our agenda. Leadership, really, really important in terms of developing a new culture and training where we are. Communication, we have some issues where sometimes things can be lost in communication in the digital world that we've found. So we need to work on that and how we correspond with one another. There's efficiencies, there's value for the public purse to be derived by what we do with our estate. I've talked about issues of fairness and inequality and working against those things. Both how the organisation manages and considers our performance in terms of what we have to deliver to the public, but also how we appraise our own staff are things on the table for discussion. We've talked about the work, home, the public-private challenges and how we work through that. And again, how we develop that culture and how we might need policy in order to try and control some of those issues. And then finally on there, and I've already referred to this, we don't know what a workplace is going to be looking like in terms of statutory requirements around health and safety in the future, or the timings. So we need to be really careful about that. So we're looking closely at that, but we're also looking at when that comes in, how do we work with our staff to build the confidence for people to come back into the workplace and operate successfully without a fear of concerns around infection or different ways of operating and working. So that's hopefully a practical summary of what we discovered. As we go through, and I'm sure the chair will permit some questions as we go forward. And again, just as I close, I want to thank the UEA again for the excellent work that they have done with us, and also how quickly some of that research is translated into effective practice for us as an organisation, for which we're hugely grateful. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Certainly feel the virtual applause. I thought that was a really fascinating presentation, and what a fantastic example of universities and an organisation working together and producing some great work. Okay, so we have, I think, about 10 minutes or so for some questions. I've not done this or used this function of Zoom yet before. We have this Q&A function, and hopefully you can find that on your screen. If you have a question or just a point to raise or anything you'd like to share with the group, we would really love to hear from you. It can be towards the speakers or towards the other panelists, but hopefully towards the speakers most importantly. We have one question towards Stephen Wood. Stephen, the University of Leicester is currently planning a hybrid working policy that involves redesigning many campus spaces as hot desk zones. In light of the strong feedback on campus working, which seems focused around redesign elements such as these, do you feel the university should reconsider the hot desking element of this policy?
I think it wouldn't be appropriate. I assume this is a question from someone at Leicester University, is it? I think it's not appropriate for me in public to make statements about either my own preferences or the university's. But to put it in general terms, I think it's too premature to dismiss anything as Steve implied, and to do the sort of analysis that Steve has done. I think the question I would, if I would be broaching diplomacy. I would say that the sort of the question to ask is: has the university done this kind of analysis that Steve's done and his colleagues have done at the Constabulary, and then we can work on it. And as I'll reinforce my point that people's satisfaction or dissatisfaction levels should not be the sole criteria. But secondly, more importantly, these satisfaction figures have factored in to some extent the fact that we were in this Dunkirk spirit. And when people talk about I'm happy to have hybrids, they may well be factoring in that that's what the university will allow. Certainly no one thinks the university is going to allow 100% working from home. I mean, and people have factored that in. So when you ask them, do you want hybrid? They say yes, and then they say, well, the university wouldn't allow anything. So I could say some more, but I think, what was the last point of the question, Mike?
I think you've maybe said enough. I mean, it was a specific question about hot desking policy at the university, which, as you said, you might not be able to answer. I tell you what, there's another question that's coming from Katie Bailey, and maybe we can have a view from each of the speakers. So the issue of isolation came up in both presentations. How can work be organised in the future to address this? More fundamentally, what aspects of isolation are the most significant? So I don't know, Stephen, if you want to think about isolation first.
Well, let Steve go, because I've
Steve?
Yes, I think it's really interesting. And I think Stephen just talked there around sort of the Leicester view. From a constabulary view, one of the things that we have said is we can't have a situation where people have no contact whatsoever within the organisation. So the policy that we have is people need to spend at least the equivalent of 1 day in every 2 working weeks within that. So that's really, really important in terms of some of those things. What we have also found as well, which seems a little bit odd, is I'm trying to think about the simplest way of explaining this. A number of departments have created, if you like, just what we would call space, I suppose, online, which is bringing people in and just saying, we've got no agenda, we're not going to be talking about work, we're not going to be talking about anything. Whatever people want to just engage with, this is what we're going to concentrate on. So that's about an hour in everyone's week. So that seems to have been quite successful, and sometimes they've given rise to all kinds of sort of discussions and people doing talks and all sorts of bits and pieces. So for us, the position is there must be some degree of physical presence and there must be that interaction, but we're looking at different ways of people coming together. But also, creating space that's not necessarily confined within an agenda or an exact meeting in the digital world to try and replicate some of that less work-focused sort of discussion and engagement.
Thank you, Steve.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I think this is a really good example where you know the best way to learn about crime, the white collar crime, someone said about 30 years ago, was to go to Switzerland because they didn't have any. So in this case, I was thinking, let's go to those people who are already isolated. And one of the things that came out of the focus group was part-timers felt isolated from the organisation because they were treated as second-class citizens. They didn't conform to the ideal type worker. These were people going in campus. So there's a group of workers who are already isolated, part-timers, people working in low task independent jobs. Someone who's worked in the archives at the library, or someone who's worked in the pension archive, who's the custodian of all the pension documents that are still in hard form and so on. They feel pretty isolated in the first place. So let's go to them and say, instead of saying, what did we do wrong with these people? What did we do wrong with these people that were left like that? And then learn from that experience. That's one thing you could build it, like learning from the Swiss situation in crime. But that's one idea I had. And the other thing is that it's not, definitely is not about, the solution is not that managers say they're working at home or even working in the office. Instead of going up to your employee every sort of week and say, "I'll just phone him," or using phones. People don't use phones anymore, which I think is very sad. You text them or whatever that people do and say, "How are you doing?" with the line manager. I don't think people want this because it smacks of spying, and a couple of people in the focus groups said that they had some problems with their line manager. So it has to be much more subtle than this. The third point I would make, it's about psychological belonging, not as well as contact. And so making people belong to the organisation is it really about everything we ever do? Does the organisation have a strong mission? Has it conveyed this? Has it got a strategy that people can understand and engage? And I suspect I think Steve's Cambridgeshire Constabulary sounds like quite an exception for the public sector. I mean, the thing at the universities, or several ones I've been to recently, possibly the exception of LSE, when they design strategy, they think it's about doing everything. The first thing about strategy is what you're not going to do. And then so people can see we're not going to be doing this. What we're going to do is this, and we're going to concentrate on this, and then get enthusiasm behind this. And then some of the things we've talked about people blurring their boundaries at home, become a non-problem because they feel that they integrate their work and life around the enthusiasm of their work. That doesn't necessarily mean long hours. It doesn't necessarily mean long hours. It's just that work-life balance becomes integral because they're doing something with purpose, and that's one thing we've not talked about today. Just to finish off, Mike, if I may, that one aspect of well-being, apart from anxiety and depression, is this sense of purpose, and we've measured that to some extent. And people got a sense of purpose from the pandemic to some extent, but I think they want that continued. They want to see where we're going and so on. I think and some of these things can be resolved, I think.
Thank you, Stephen. There's a couple of questions for Steve. We've probably got just one more minute, if you don't mind, Steve. One question about how you deal with jokes about people not working when they're at home, and then a question about estates and how you manage space. Maybe if you could just handle one of those questions, that'd be great.
Excellent. I'll do the one I'm looking at, which is the one around space at the same time. Very diverse workforce, and our estate planning has had to change significantly. So we have some estate footprint that has to have a lot of people in at one time. We have to have a certain number of police officers to react to emergencies that have to be on shifts. So we will start to see a shift towards a state that has a lot of people in a lot of time, and that's going to need a huge footprint, particularly if we end up in the position of restrictions around contact. But a number of other people don't need to be together. So we will have a lot of the more non-operational teams who don't have to work together. The challenge we're finding is making sure they do have an opportunity to come together. So we don't have a team of 5 and everyone's in on a different day, Monday to Friday, and never see one another. So it's a mix for us, but it also links into the estate to make sure that it's safe and functional, as well as the people-related issues being where they need to be.
Great. Thank you, Steve, and thank you for all the questions. One final set of thoughts from Kevin. I'll hand over to Kevin who will talk about what's coming up in the future.
Great. So thanks, Mike, and excellent sharing, Mike, and two brilliant presentations I felt from Stephen and Steve, which are really informative and obviously very, the reason why we chose them was because it's such contemporary, relevance of the things that both researching and changes are making in organisations. So I'd certainly like to thank both of our speakers, which congratulations for us for choosing them as well. So obviously we've got really good taste. And with that in mind, we'll be running a second session on the 8th of July, which is looking at special considerations for minority groups. And we've got confirmed Professor Gail Kinman from Birkbeck, who some of you will know has been working with the Public Health England project with the Society of Occupational Medicine, issuing guidance about home working and what to do in the pandemic. So she'll be bringing that experience with her. As many of you know, she's an expert on return to work issues. So, but she's also been looking at other issues concerned with different minority groups as well as part of her work for Public Health England. So that will be an excellent session. She's a brilliant speaker, as some of us will already know that's seen to speak before. And a bit later in the year, on the 23rd of September, these are all 1 till 2 on a Thursday, by the way, my colleague Sarah Connolly, who is an economist, has been working on issues around performance and productivity and wellbeing, and she'll be teaming up with Martin, one of our co-organisers. Will be talking about how to make the business case for wellbeing. So Martin's got the practical experience of having done it at the MOD. I'm sure he'll give us some political insights with a small p on how to persuade people, which goes beyond simply the pound values that you can attach to these things. And our last event in this series will be on the 14th of October, when we're going to bring together all of the speakers. So I hope Stephen and Steve can come back and have a wash up basically on the lessons that we've learned through this particular seminar series, but also more generally on the future normal. And we'll have a better idea what the future normal looks like in a few months' time as well. So thank you to our speakers again. Thanks to everyone at King's that's helped organise this, Izzy in particular, who you can't see, and my co-organisers, Mike and Martin, of course, and all of you for turning up. What I would like you to do is A, turn up to the next ones, and B, tell all your mates to turn up. And that'd be great. So thank you, everybody, and I'll leave it for Mike to have the last word.
Thank you, Kevin. There's no need for any more words. So yeah, thank you very much for coming along, and I hope to see you all next time.